I think when it comes to dietary advice, there isn't one thing that is more changeable than that, because as we all know, there are press stories, for example, saturated fats are okay to eat, and that is very confusing for the public. I think what's been great about tonight is we've had some real evidence from some real experts about why that is simply not the case. And the studies that we've been shown prove really beyond belief that polyunsaturated fats are clearly better for all the markers, the biomarkers of heart disease, than saturated fats. And that is a message that I can now confidently take home and tell my patients.
Saturated fat is found mainly in animal fat, and it's associated particularly with fatty meat, red meat, but also dairy fat. And in the traditional Northern European diet, we used to have really quite high levels of saturated fat intake, and that's changed a lot over the last 30 years. Levels have come down as they've been replaced by vegetable oils, and over that time period rates of heart disease have gone down, and we see countries coming in from former Eastern European countries that are changing the type of fat they're eating away from the animal fats towards vegetable oils. We see a tumbling in rates of heart disease. Saturated fat raises blood cholesterol, something that's been known for quite a long time, and we know without doubt that raised blood cholesterol causes atherosclerosis, the fundamental disorder that leads to cardiovascular disease.
I think there's a tremendous amount of confusion about diet, because the media actually print one thing about one study one day and something different the next day with differing advice. And I think that the media should have a responsible right to investigate those studies thoroughly and actually only publish what is consistent messaging and the messages that have actually been properly researched, and come to charities such as Heart UK for comment on the studies. I think there has to be consistent messaging for around sat fat and around diet generally, because there is so much confusion. People are getting fed up with it, quite frankly.
The questions that have come about saturated fat have really been coming from epidemiological studies which have tried to look at individual variability in populations and usual intake of saturated fat. And generally there's a very small proportion of the variability in blood cholesterol is due to saturated fat intakes. But if you take groups that are really quite different, and I did this some years ago, looked at strict vegetarians, vegans, and very low intake of saturated fat compared with meat eaters, we could show huge difference in their blood cholesterol levels. But what's happened over the time, that the typical diet has moved much closer to that of the vegans. Now, we still see differences in their saturated fat intake, but the cholesterol levels in the UK population are now much lower than they were 30 or 40 years ago. And I've been measuring blood cholesterol in people for about 40 years. So it has gone down, and that's mainly, I think, due to a reduction in saturated fat and replacement with polyunsaturated fats, but also to some extent with monounsaturated fats that come from oils like olive oil.
Well, I think we heard what most of us suspect, particularly from Alison Headstone, that people actually do know the main messages. But I think what they're looking for are all sorts of excuses or reasons to hear messages they want to hear. So all this recent stuff about fat actually being good for you, which we know it isn't so, but that was the message that came across in the media. That's what people wanted to hear. It's an excuse for them to be able to have the food that they like, to do the things they do. So certainly amongst patients and people I've talked to, everybody's latched onto that message without questioning it as much as they should, because it's what they want to hear. The root of all this is that I think people know a lot of the messages: eat less calories, do more exercise, eat less fat, eat less salt, but it's making people do it, or helping people do it, but making people do it. Maybe we need to be a bit more paternalistic.
I've had a fantastically interesting evening, and it's always good as purely as a human being to have it reinforced how we should be eating. I think probably for me, the two things I've taken away from this, one is maybe we need to be educating the public not only on what they are eating, but how they should eat, because I think fundamentally that's where a lot of us are getting it wrong. I think the other thing is, if I was going to sort of package this whole fat debate up in terms of a media comment, I think I'd probably look at it as the good, the bad, and the ugly of fat, because I think we need to tell the public, you know, there are lots of different dimensions to fat. It's just really not just one entity.
The evidence is pretty strong that, you know, reducing saturated fat helps lower blood cholesterol. It's not the only thing. You've got to watch your weight as well, and you can do a little bit more. I mean, plant sterols, for example, would add a little bit to lowering blood cholesterol. So for many people, you know, lifestyle changes can lower their blood cholesterol a bit, and in turn that can reduce their risk of cardiovascular disease.
I think we heard some data today which was quite reassuring that we are achieving things, but everybody has to work together. So if we look at salt, for example, we heard that, you know, one person or one company trying to reduce salt is going to struggle unless everybody's doing it, because people would follow where their flavour buds want them to go. So it has to be at a wider level, but I think there was good evidence there that cardiovascular disease has been reduced by changes in diet and attitude and knowledge about fats and what's good for us and where our cholesterol should be. So I think we're making tiny steps, but we've got a long way to go.
I think one of the problems about animal fats versus vegetable fats is that the public, they eat food, as we heard Tom Sanders say earlier on, and just talking about fats and good and bad fats is confusing, even for doctors, I have to say. And what we really want is a simple way of getting across that message that, you know, everything in moderation. Yes, some saturated fats are acceptable, but generally there's a body of evidence out there that shows that they are not something that you can eat too much of, and actually if you do eat too much of them, you're more likely to develop heart disease, which confirms all the advice that we've been giving as a profession for years now.